Hello, and welcome to the latest episode of History You Didn't Know But Should. I'm Ray.
And I'm Chris.
And today, Chris, we're going to be looking once again at the 20 years ago, 9/11. Last week in our episode, we looked at the events of 9/11, how we remembered those events. This week, we want to look at an incident that happened actually in Canada called Operation Yellow Ribbon. And Chris, this was actually an idea you brought to me, I guess, a week or so ago. Would you like to share with me and the listeners why this caught your attention and what inspired you to want to do a podcast about this?
Well, it's been a somber week, and I know here on the campus of Blaine Community College, we've been sharing with our students through a very nice Walk to Remember memorial that the college has done, and we've been going through the different steps and the stages of 9/11. And as I was doing that, the one thing I kept thinking about was that life was still going on even during 9/11. I mean, just as our nation changed, at that moment, while we say it was the moment that time stopped, but stuff was still going on. I mean, we mentioned where we were, we mentioned what we were doing. The banks were open, the restaurants were open, the stores were still doing. But Ray, when you start seeing planes hitting buildings and aiming for specific locations, and that there are multiple hijack situations, I mean, we start thinking about all of the planes that were in the sky that day. What do you do with travel? What do we do with security? While time stops, it still goes on. And so I remember from a Broadway show, and I know a lot of times I go back to Broadway shows, but I remember from a Broadway show that told the story of hope and courage, but generosity, as you mentioned, from our Canadian friends, and how it inspires us as we continue to think about the lasting legacy of 9/11, that part of that has to be do good, be good. And that's why I wanted to talk about this today.
Yeah, I think that's great. And Chris, you talked about the Walk to Remember. I was leaving campus on Friday and saw you and a whole bunch of students, I guess you were leading them, doing the Walk to Remember. And it reminded me of something we talked about in the last episode, how 100% of those kids were not born on 9/11. And the way I heard one historian put it this past week was 9/11 has gone from memory to history. For us, it's memory, as we talked about in the last episode. For these kids, it's history. It's something that only exists in the history books and on the TV screens.
And it's history, but there's also actions we take from that history. That we take this history, and as how horrific as it was, that there are some moments of heroism. There are some moments of generosity. And I don't know, Ray, as we talk about this story today, I think that in the dark of 9/11, up there in Newfoundland and in Canada,
the tippy top,
there was a little ray of sunshine. Yeah. And letting the world know we're going to be okay.
Yeah, it wasn't all dark. And what happened on 9/11 is the United States at 9:42 a.m. on 9/11, the Air Traffic Control System Command Center learned that a third plane, American Flight 877, crashed into the Pentagon, the head of American military power in Northern Virginia. And they initiated something called the Security Control of Air Force Traffic and Air Navigation Aids, which was only the second time, I understand, in American history that this had actually been invoked outside of tests and drills. And with that, on September 11, 2001, when the code name, and I may get this wrong, some of our military, Air Force, pilot friends may correct my pronunciation, Scatana, when that command went across the air traffic control system, basically planes in American airspace had to land immediately. They had to find the nearest airport they could land at and had to land. And of course, then you had the situation, what do we do with some 45,000 people on airplanes coming across the Atlantic Ocean, and then additional ones coming across the Pacific Ocean? If they were past the so-called point of no return, that is, the plane couldn't safely turn around and go back to where it came from, they had to find a place to land. And Canada had to step up and say, okay, we're going to take these planes. When the United States would not allow international flights into its borders, a lot of these planes had to go in, coming across the Atlantic anyway, which is what we're going to focus on, had to go into Canada.
And I think it's good for us to pause and to think through this, because if anybody is unfamiliar with how air traffic control works, take a moment and just go and Google air traffic control radar, or right, just for a moment see that at any given time, just in the United States, there are so many airplanes that are in the air, flying here to there and at this amount of altitude. I mean, that is probably one of the most stressful jobs.
It's gotta be.
Is being an air traffic controller.
I could not do it. The stress on me would kill me. I could never do a job.
Because you hold thousands of people's lives in your hands by telling when someone can land and when somebody can take off and where they go and where they not. And I find it interesting that in 1971 that program was initiated, right? That Scatana that you were talking about. So in 1971, somebody had the bright idea that, hey, there might come a time when we need to get every plane in the sky down on the ground because there's an emergency that's going on. And 1971 there was a lot, there was air traffic and all, but it's nothing like it is today. And for them, with the technology of 1971, to be able to institute a code word that if you hear this one word, every pilot, every air traffic controller, when they heard that word come across their radio, knew that at that moment you've got to find the nearest airport and you've got to land, and don't worry about why you got to land, don't worry about what's happening, you've just got to put that bird on the ground and you've got to just hang on. And so I think on that day, if I'm not mistaken, there were like 4,200 planes that were in the sky in the United States at the moment that the final aircraft had crashed. And so was that right? Was it about 4,200? So at that moment when this Scatana goes out, you're telling 4,200 planes,
find a place to land.
Find a place and do it now.
It doesn't matter. They could be on their way to Los Angeles from New York and be over Oklahoma. You got to land in Oklahoma. Because
what's happening, right? The people who are overseeing all of this have no idea what's a target, what's legitimate.
Which planes have hijackers aboard, and I believe I watched, in preparing for this, I watched a number of news reports from the days and weeks following 9/11 on this particular subject, and there was a plane, and I believe it was coming from Alaska, I could be wrong on that they suspected might be another one of these planes, and it was tracked with military aircraft. And basically there was a lady who was a fighter pilot was told, if necessary, take that plane out.
And why? What do you remember why it was? It was a Korean airline.
Yeah.
Who was scheduled to land, I think, in Anchorage or something, right? And ultimately make its way to New York. Mm-hmm. But it was a language barrier issue.
Yeah, that was it. Yes.
And so there's another element to this. You've got to get 4,200 planes down with language issues, with technology issues, with airlines.
Chaos.
It's chaos.
Yeah, and I was also watching. Me. If I get sidetracked on something related to presidential history, I'm going there.
Right.
And Air Force One was up in the air, and there's this picture of George W. Bush in the hallway along the side of Air Force One, and they're all looking out the window at this jet that's so close to Air Force One. They said they could see the pilot looking back at them. So there was a lot of fear, a lot of uncertainty as Air Force One itself was coming back in, and you had all these planes having to land. And one of the people that was being interviewed in one of the news reports I watched was a Canadian air official who got the call, American airspace is closed. And he said I had to ask him a second time, repeat that. Because he said he thought, all right, New York City's closed, I get that.
Right.
But when they came across the United States is closed to air traffic, it's just, he said it was just this sinking feeling at first, and then it's like, all right, we're up now.
Right. And the fact is, once again, I'm not 100% familiar with all of these things, but what I also do know is that you can't just land a 747 at the Elizabethtown airport.
No.
You have to have a runway that is sufficient that will be able to handle the plane. So when you're in the air and give the code word, you then have to scramble and try to find the airport that will hold this particular plane while trying to make sure that all the planes are not trying to land at the same time, and that this is massive chaos. And I have, we talk about the heroes of 9/11. I don't know if we give enough attention to the heroes that were in those air traffic control towers.
The heroes in the air traffic control towers, and I think as we're going to talk today about a little town called Gander.
Yes.
Gander, Newfoundland.
Yes, and I think it's wonderful to figure out about Newfoundland or Newfoundland, and there's so much joy that comes out of the discovery of this particular thing. And many people probably didn't know about Gander. Gander was a place that had basically 10,000 residents that were there, and all of a sudden they were going to be asked to be one of the places in which double the population was about to land there, I think.
Yeah, and it was the Gander International Airport, which my understanding is when we think about Gander International Airport, don't think about Atlanta Airport, don't think about anything like that. They had to reroute there at Gander 38 jumbo jets coming into that airport there, which was actually a World War II airport that was used for refueling transatlantic flights during World War II. And bring in 38 jumbo jets.
Yeah, that you mentioned the World War II about it was for the transatlantic, but I also found in the research that it was a staging point for U-boat hunting flights. Yeah. And we remember during that time there was the big fear that U-boats were encroaching upon the East Coast, and so you would have these these staging points where they could fuel up, load up, and be able to travel up and down the coast. So it's a place that none of us probably were familiar with, but all of a sudden it will go in the history books, as you just mentioned.
And this guy who worked at the Gander International Airport at the time, and of course these news reports I was watching, were a year after, a few weeks or months after, and he said that he was told to go, I guess, to the runway. He was an emergency person, and he said he looked out. He didn't know what was going on, but he said he looked up and he saw this jumbo jet coming down, and it landed. And he said then he looked back and there came another one, and they were just lined up, these jumbo jets. Like I said, 38 of them landed at the Gander Airport, and they literally parked them wing to wing. And some 6,600 passengers and crew aboard those planes. This small town of Gander, Newfoundland, had to absorb these people. But not only, before we even get to the point of having to absorb these people, they've got to inform these people. This wasn't 2021 where everybody had smartphones and all this. So these people, the pilots have to be informed what's going on, and then the pilots have to let their passengers know what's going on. And I can imagine the fear being on an airplane on 9/11, hearing what has just happened at the Pentagon, what has just happened in New York and in Pennsylvania, and now you're going to some strange town in Newfoundland, and you don't know when you're going home, because there's no telling how long this event will last.
And let's add to that. So these, as the Gander people would call them, these plane people,
Yeah.
have just been informed. They have just landed. But Ray, there is so much chaos because 4 regular typical planes out for a normal flight didn't make it back to their destination.
Right,
And who's to say that parked on the airstrip at Gander is one of those planes?
Right.
I mean, there's fear that's there because you start getting little bit of information and then people start talking, and next thing you know, you have this gossip fest that comes. People don't know. They didn't have, as you mentioned, the 24-hour news cycle. And so then there's the fear, well, is somebody on our plane?
Yeah. And they have to sit on these planes a long time. Once they land in Gander, it's not like, okay, welcome to Gander, get off the plane.
Right.
Some of these passengers sat on these planes.
Like 24 hours, I think, right?
I mean, a long time, because they had Gander, their bus system, I guess you call it their city bus system, was on strike. Now, thankfully, these people came off strike to respond to this crisis. And, these people are coming off the airplanes. They've got to have a place to sleep. They got to have food to eat. And that, I think, Chris, is where the town of Gander, the ordinary people of Gander, stepped up in such a big and amazing way.
You just mentioned that the bus drivers in the Gander transportation system, if I understood you right,
Yes.
you said that they were on strike when this happened.
Right.
And you're saying that they stopped their strike for whatever it is they were striking for.
Yeah.
But they stopped their strike, got onto buses, and did their jobs, and brought people to wherever they needed to go. That speaks of just amazing generosity.
It does. And, again, going back to the video, and I encourage our listeners just to go on YouTube. And I love YouTube. YouTube's a wonderful thing. And look at some of these news reports, and you'll see it where somebody on one of the planes was filming this, and out of the darkness, it's just this convoy of buses. Here they come. And remember, some 4,000 passengers and crew, they've got to transport to a different location.
And I understand also that not only were the buses coming to take people to various places to help them out, but that also there were medical personnel who were willing to evaluate people and make sure that they had the medication that they need, that they met them at the plane with homemade bagged lunches.
Yes.
6,700 people landing, and you've got the town of Gander of 10,000 that start making homemade peanut butter and jelly or whatever. That is just an amazing story right there.
Yeah, teachers going through their closets at home, pulling out all the sheets and blankets and pillows and pillowcases that they're not using, bringing to the high school or the local college where these people are going to be bunked up for who knows how long. Cooking food, buying food. I mean, this town went above and beyond the call of duty for these people, these several thousand people. I mean, the town of Gander doubled in population.
Right.
Was it 6,600 some people were on those planes? Doubled in population in just a few hours, and the people of the town really came through.
But not only did they come through with the bag lunches and the buses and things like that, but Gander wasn't expecting this surge. I mean, they wouldn't have this many people in a tourist season coming to Gander, so you don't have hotels to be able to put all of these people. And yes, they open up the schools and they open up the civic centers, but oh my gosh, the other thing that we start to see, they open up their homes to strange people in a strange
flew in
land.
on an airplane.
Yes, that, according to the news, 4 other airplanes have just crashed because of people that were on that airplane, hijackers. And so these people open up their homes and begin striking up conversations and try to help people who are on those planes who don't have an understanding as to what's going on. They try to give them a sense of warmth and comfort and just being present with them. And I just think that is absolutely so powerful.
Yeah, and there's an interesting story that comes out of this situation at Gander. You had a Continental flight, Continental Airlines Flight 5 from London to Houston was there at Gander. It was one of the planes that flew to that had to land at Gander, and there was a lady, a Houston resident named Diane Kursick aboard this plane. Do you know this story?
I don't know all of that story, but it sounds like you got something good that you're about to share, and I'm glad you're sharing the story.
Yeah, it's a weird story for me to be sharing. But there was a British businessman by the name of Nick Marson on the plane, and they were taken to the same shelter about 30 miles outside of Gander. They started talking. Eventually, Nick goes back to Britain, couldn't forget Diane, and then several months later he's transferred to Houston, where he proposes to this person, and they are married a year after they first met, and they go back to Gander, where they wanted to honeymoon in Gander, and said they thought they were going to have a meeting with some Gander residents, and it ended up being this. They walk into this huge party that the Gander residents have put together for them. So even a year later, the residents of Gander are still, investing in these people who came out of the sky.
So you just told us a little ditty about Nick and Diane, and, and how they found love.
What's the song? Is it Nick
a little ditty about Jack and Diane, but this is Nick and Diane, right?
Nick and Diane,
so it still works.
Yeah.
But you just shared with us that you can find love in all sorts of circumstances.
I guess you can find it at the Gander Airport or somewhere.
But hey, you know what? I didn't know all of that story, right? But what I find interesting is that there's a Newfoundland tradition that I was introduced to when you were talking about that story. That was that whenever you go to Gander or you go to Newfoundland, the tradition is that you got to drink a lot of alcohol and you have to kiss a codfish.
Yeah.
So these people who were sitting on these planes, it probably was helpful to be able to understand these traditions and to learn a lot about them, because it kind of took their mind off of not being able to be with family. I mean, this is a trying time to be scared about things that were going on and all of those aspects. And I think that one of the people in Gander said that they did all of this without any instructions.
Yeah.
It was natural to them. And I think somebody said that 99% of the people in Newfoundland are huggers. That's just their living thing. So Ray, you might not go.
I'd be miserable.
So you
I would be miserable.
You might not visit Gander.
You would see me running down the street. Get away from me!
But they bring these people in and they welcome them and they love them and they care for them. But there is one other thing that I found interesting, is that in that moment and for the remaining few days, with all of these planes on the ground and with all of these people together, everybody was on a level playing field.
Yeah.
All religion, politics, everybody was the same. Whether you were first class or cargo.
Yeah, it didn't matter.
It didn't matter. And, I mean, I can only imagine that, here they are in a new country and...
going back to what you were saying, in all the news reports I watched about this, all the reading I've done about this, I didn't read a single article. I didn't hear a story about a single person. I'm sure it happened. People are people. I didn't read about a single incident of someone like telling someone off or something like that. I'm sure it happened. I'm not saying it didn't. I mean, people are people wherever they are. But it's amazing how the majority, just did what had to be done. Whether they were on the plane or whether they were in Gander, the majority did what had to be done. And they were there in Gander, by the way, for 5 days before they could fly back.
It just shows you the power of goodness.
Yeah.
And kindness.
It does. And a year after the tragedy, September 11, 2002, 2,500 people gathered at the Gander International Airport to mark the anniversary of the attacks, where the Prime Minister of Canada, addressed the crowd, and he talks about what happened at New York. But he says, "Thanks to the countless acts of kindness and compassion done for these stranded visitors, it will live forever in memory as a day of comfort and healing, end quote, which of course is what we're trying to emphasize today, that 9/11 was a tragedy, but here in Gander, it was a period of time that showed a good side of people. While 9/11 showed the bad side of what people could do, it also brought out the good side, not just in Gander, but even in the United States.
Outside of Newfoundland, Canada, probably outside of Gander, none of us had ever heard of Gander before.
Right. I had never heard of Gander before doing research for this episode.
But what does this show us? It shows us that it doesn't matter your education. It doesn't matter your background. It doesn't matter your socioeconomic status. What it shows us is that you can change the world from your own doorstep.
Now, you mentioned a Broadway show. Was it Come From Away?
Come From Away.
That you saw?
Yes. Absolutely phenomenal. And by the way, so if you have Apple TV, I think they're just releasing the Broadway film, the Broadway version of it on Apple TV.
I'll have to watch that. A piece of Gander is included in the 9/11 Museum in New York. Apparently, it's a small tile that a lady who was stranded in Gander purchased from a gift shop, and she brought back to New York with her. So Gander is in the 9/11 Museum.
See, and you know what? I mean, as we come to a close in this podcast and to a close on our series on 9/11, one of the things that I think we can take away from this is Ray, we don't have to be huggers.
No.
But we can be kind.
Yeah. Everybody can do something.
Everybody can make a difference. I mean, for these people, it was a hand-wrapped peanut butter and jelly sandwich. It was a
blanket.
Welcome.
Yeah.
It was just looking out the plane window and seeing bus after bus after bus. It was a friendly greeting, or shoot, it was, why don't you kiss a dead codfish? I mean, but something to take your mind away from what was going on at home and being away from loved ones, because we all know that during difficult times you want to be around people that you love, because that's that comfort. Right. And these people were forced to fly to a strange land, to be with strange people. I mean, my gosh, a 3-hour flight with the person next to us can be very unbearable, and imagine being forced to land and stuck with them for several days.
5 days, yeah.
So I think it is important for us, just be kind.
Yeah, because the people of Gander could have said, not our problem, let air traffic control deal with this, but they didn't. Chris, thanks for another great episode. I hope our audience enjoyed this episode just as much as we did. I know I enjoyed studying about this. Thank you for bringing this topic to our attention, because I had never heard about this. I guess to my eternal shame, I had never heard about this.
Operation Yellow Ribbon.
Operation Yellow. When you said Operation Yellow Ribbon, first thing I thought, we're going to do an episode about yellow ribbons. But anyway, so hopefully you've enjoyed the episode. If you'd like to learn more about history you didn't know but should, you can check out our Facebook page. We're also on Twitter. You can find us on Sounder FM, Stitcher, Google Podcast, and Spotify. Until next time, I'm Ray.
And I'm Chris.
And talk to you later.